Strathpeffer Junction, Easter Ross, Highland Scotland, March 1938, 6:45 in the morning. Alasdair Gillies, 43, had been doing this round for 11 years. He had the bicycle loaded at the sub-office by 6, and on the road before the light properly arrived. The bag weighed 30 pounds, heavier than average, which meant parcels, and the track east of Contin that served the Upper Glen farms was still soft from the thaw. He would cycle the first 8 miles on the metalled road, then walk. 11 years on this round had taught him the upper path, the way you learn a face. Not from a rule, but from the accumulation of 11 identical marches. This was a documented type Highland postal round. 6 farms, 2 crofts, and a gamekeeper's cottage spread across 14 miles of single-track lane and open moorland. The standard issue post office bicycle, heavy, black, built to the post office's own specification, with a reinforced front carrier capable of bearing the morning bag, had been loaded at Strathpeffer after the main delivery arrived from Dingwall on the early service. That bag had come down from Inverness on the overnight mail train. By the time Alasdair Gillies left the sub-office at 6, the letters in his carrier had already been moving through the postal system for 8 hours. The lower farms would have their post by 7:30. The Upper Croft, a mile and a half beyond the last gate, upper track that the post office had never classified as a road, would have its letters by 9. If the going was reasonable. In a Highland march, the going was sometimes not reasonable. In those cases, he walked the full distance in both directions. There was no provision for the alternative. He had 1 envelope for the Upper Croft this morning. He had known since the sorting at 5:30. He knew the handwriting. He knew whose farm it was going to. He did not know what it said. What did Alasdair Gillies know about the Upper Croft that the envelope in his bag did not? And what did the envelope know about the people in that croft that 11 years on the same path had never been able to carry for them? Before the letters reached Alasdair Gillies' bag, they had passed through a system that most people on his round had never thought about and had no reason to. A letter posted in Glasgow on a Tuesday evening would pass through the Glasgow sorting office overnight, travel on the mail train to Inverness, be sorted at Inverness for the Dingwall sub-district, to arrive at Dingwall on the early morning service, to be bagged for the Strathpeffer sub-office, and reach the Highland Round postman's hands at around 5:30 in the morning. From there, by bicycle and by foot, it would cover the final 14 miles. The post office bicycle that carried it was built to a specification the post office had maintained almost unchanged since the 1920s. A heavy-duty carrier cycle, upright in posture, with a reinforced front frame designed to bear the morning bag without flex. Single speed, rod braked, built to last a decade of daily use on roads like these. The standard specification changed little between the 1920s and the 1960s, the same essential machine serving city rounds in Birmingham and moorland tracks in Easter Ross. What changed between those two applications was not the bicycle, but the distance, the terrain, and the number of times the postman would need to dismount and walk. The post office called this kind of Highland delivery a walk, not a round, as urban deliveries were called, but a walk, because that was what it was. What the terminology did not capture was what 11 years of the same walk produced in the person who walked it. What did the system that sent the letter require of the man who carried it beyond the road that vehicles could use? And what did 11 years of returning to the part the bicycle could not reach build in Alasdair Gillies that the post office had never asked him to carry? Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you've been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the Royal Mail between 1900 and 1980, the vehicle, the round, the sorting office, and the letter that the system carried. Not nostalgia for red vans. The documented operational reality of a postal system, and the specific human meaning of what it delivered. before the telephone changed what it meant to wait for news. What Kenneth Mackay carried over the Scriob 3 times a week between Tarbert and Rhenigidale was not a bag of letters. It was the only regular evidence for a community with no road, no doctor, and no shop that the world beyond the hill remembered them. And if you grew up watching for the postman at a farm road end, or knew a Tommy Postie who swept the snow and brought in coal along with the morning letters, put it in the comments. Did you know a postman like this? One who walked the same path for 20 years and knew your family's name before he reached the gate? Or did someone in your family wait for a letter at a farm road end on an island? Or on a hill where the postman was the only regular visitor? Put it in the comments. In a future video, the village sub-post office network, the counter behind the general store door, and what it meant to be the postal system's final point of contact with the communities that needed it most. Back, on the round, the rural postman's route was called, by the postal service, a walk. The terminology was official and accurate. It distinguished the Highland or moorland delivery from the urban round, a word that implied a circuit of streets covered largely on bicycle. A walk was different. A walk was a line, not a circuit. It went out from the sub-office or the collection point and came back along the same path by which it had gone. Some walks in Britain covered up to 20 miles, 6 days a week, 52 weeks a year. The route was fixed. The same farms, the same sequence, the same distances, covered in the same order every working morning. Postal historians have found, in the FEW route cards that survived, the post office did not systematically preserve them, and most have been lost. The precise documentation of what a postman was required to carry and where. The Royal Mail Archive holds very few of these records. Most of what we know of the specific character of individual walks comes from the oral accounts of the postmen who walked them, or from the families on the farms that received them. What the route card could not record was what the walk produced in the person who walked it. Not the distances, those were documented, but the knowledge that accumulated with each year. Which farm road was impassable after 3 days of rain? Which gate latch froze in January? Which farmhouse dog needed passing on the left? Which household had its lights on before the postman arrived, and which did not? And what the difference meant. Stuart Lewis, who walked a 15-mile route around Shap in Cumbria, was heartbroken when the post office gave him a van in the 1960s. He had walked it in mist and snow and horizontal rain. Not once in years had they failed to complete the round. The post office called it a walk. The postmen who walked it for 20 years called it something closer to a life. What did the walk produce in the people who walked it? And what did the communities on those walks understand about the postman that no route card had ever published? 11 years on the same walk drew a map that no post office survey had ever produced. Alasdair Gillies knew the Upper Glen the way a doctor knows a patient. Not from a file, but from accumulation. He knew which farm had a son in the Merchant Navy who had not written since October. He knew which household was waiting for a pension determination. He knew which of the older women on the Upper Croft was likely to have her lamp lit before he arrived in winter, and what it meant when the lamp was dark and the door still shut by 9. He was not a welfare officer. He had no official function beyond delivering the mail. What he had, after 11 years, was a working knowledge of 14 miles of human circumstance that no official record and no census contained. He had built it the way the walk itself was built, step by step, week by week, by being the same person, on the same path, on the same 6 mornings, every week, year after year. This was not unique to Highland Scotland. Thomas Thompson, known to his community as Tommy Postie, served the village of Calthwaite in Cumbria in the 1920s and 30s. He advised farmers on when the local thresher was due. He told them of sheep that had strayed. He delivered turnip seed. He swept snow from the steps of the older residents. He brought in coal when the winter was hard. None of this was in his post office contract. All of it was what years on the same walk had made him capable of being. In rural communities where neighbours were a mile apart, the postman's daily passage was the closest thing to a daily newspaper. Not a newspaper of events, but of states. Who was well? Who was not? Whose lamp was lit? Whose was not? The map that years drew in the rural postman's hands was not a postal map. It was a map of who was waiting for what, and of who had stopped waiting, and why. What does this map tell us about what the rural postman was doing beyond delivering the morning bag? And what was lost from these communities when the walk ended, and the van arrived, and the same distance was covered in a fraction of the time? The letters that reached an isolated Highland croft or a Welsh upland farm in the 1930s and 1940s carried a specific weight that had nothing to do with their paper content. A letter from a daughter in service in Edinburgh, arriving at a croft with no telephone and no daily newspaper, was not a letter. It was the evidence that the daughter was alive, employed, and capable of writing. The interval between letters, sometimes 2 weeks, sometimes more, was the interval during which the family had no evidence of any of these things and had to wait. This was the specific emotional structure that the rural postman carried in his bag, along with the letters themselves. He was the carrier of the resolution to periods of uncertainty that had no other resolution available to them. In communities where the telephone had not arrived and would not arrive for another decade, the letter was not a supplement to other forms of communication. It was the only form that connected a household to anyone beyond walking distance. The categories of letter reaching a Highland or Welsh rural community were consistent across the period. Letters from sons in the merchant navy, in the armed forces, in city employment. Letters from daughters in domestic service in Glasgow, Edinburgh, Liverpool, London. Letters from solicitors and landlords. Official correspondence carrying the weight of consequence. Letters from emigrant relatives in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, describing lives that could not be visited and could only be understood through what the letter permitted itself to say. In some Highland communities, with Gaelic as the primary spoken language, the postman sometimes read a letter aloud for a household where the recipient's English reading was limited. This was never an official function. It was what the trusted daily presence made possible. The postman who delivered a letter from a daughter in service knew, from 11 years, on the same path, whether this household had been waiting a long time or a short time for this particular envelope. He knew before he handed it over. The person at the door knew he knew. What did the act of handing over the letter mean when both the postman and the person at the door understood what the letter's arrival ended? And what did the letter carry after it was received that the postman had not been able to carry for them? Thomas Rowlands had been on the Llanfillin walk in the uplands of Powys since 1941. He was 38 when he started, and he had started because the previous postman had been called up. The walk covered 9 farms, 4 isolated cottages, and a hillside chapel across 16 miles of mountain path and drove road in the border country, where Welsh was the first language, and English the language of official correspondence. The terrain in the upper Vyrnwy Valley was different from the Highland walks in the north. Not the same open scale, but steeper and more immediately treacherous in winter. The paths above the 1,500-foot contour could be under 2 feet of snow in January, while the valley road below was merely wet. Thomas Rowlands knew this. The way a person knows the character of a place they have been present in through every condition of weather and light for over a decade. Because by 1955, 14 years of the same walk had given it to him. The farms on the upper section had no telephone until the mid-1950s, and some did not have a reliable connection until the following decade. The post was, for the duration, the only regular contact between a hill farm and the administrative world beyond it. The world of ration books, pension offices, land agents, and the children who had left for the valley towns and written back when they wrote, in English, that their parents sometimes needed help reading. In Welsh-speaking communities of this period, the postman was sometimes not only the carrier of the letter, but its interpreter, the trusted daily presence who could sit for a few minutes at a kitchen table and explain what a Ministry of Agriculture circular required of the farm. Not all rural postmen were asked to do this, but many who served Welsh upland communities long enough were trusted with it. Thomas Rowlands was. What does it mean for a postman to be the person a family trusts to read their correspondence? And what did his presence at the kitchen table, on those specific mornings, carry that no official letter could carry, and no telephone call, when it finally arrived, would replace? The rural post office carried, in practice, if not in its official mandate, more than letters. On a Highland walk, on a Welsh mountain round, on any route where the postman was the most regular human contact a household had with the world beyond its own gate. The bag acquired contents that no post office regulation had authorized. In the 1920s and 30s, this was a matter of practical necessity. A croft on a Highland hillside, 2 miles from the nearest road, had limited access to shops, medical attention, and the casual exchange of information that urban life provided daily. The postman, arriving 6 times a week, was the practical channel through which medicine prescribed at a surgery in the nearest market town could reach an elderly resident, through which a message from a neighbouring farm about a strayed animal could travel, through which a newspaper, one day late but intact, could arrive at a house that otherwise received no printed information about the wider world. None of this was listed in a postman's contract. All of it was what being a trusted daily presence made possible, and what communities on rural walks had come to depend upon. The post office was aware of this social function. By the 1960s, when van routes began replacing the walking rounds, postal administrators noted, in internal reviews of the period, that the social welfare function of the rural postman was not replaceable by a van driver covering 3 times the distance in the same time. The van arrived faster. It stopped for less time. The postman who had swept the snow from the steps of an elderly resident had done so because he was there long enough to notice that it needed doing. This was the dimension of the rural round that no operational efficiency calculation had ever found a way to measure. What it cost the post office to have a man walk 14 miles in all weathers, 6 days a week, and what it cost the community when he stopped. What is the cost of a service that appears in NO contract, cannot be measured in any review, and is only fully understood when it is gone? The hardship of the rural walking round was not metaphorical. It was physical, documented, and in one recorded case in 1908, fatal. Robert Cunningham was a postman in a remote part of Ayrshire, in the southwest of Scotland. On a morning in 1908, he set out in a severe snowstorm to complete his round. The post office required delivery. His community expected it. He completed his deliveries. The records confirm this, and was on his return journey when the cold overcame him. His body was found by a search party several days later. There is no plaque to Robert Cunningham in Ayrshire. His round continued, with a different postman, the following week. He was not the only postman whose service cost him the condition of his body. Matt Bendelow, a veteran of the First World War, walked a 9-mile round, 6 days a week, in Northumberland for 40 years, from 1921 to 1961, on one leg, in good weather, and in bad. The physical demands of the rural walk did not diminish for age or condition. Decades of long rounds in difficult terrain produced occupational damage that was poorly compensated and rarely acknowledged. Boots wore out. Joints deteriorated. The postman, who had walked 16 miles a day in all weathers for 20 years, was not offered the occupational health consideration that a factory worker might receive through a union. Edward McLaughlin, who walked a 21-mile route from Ripon in North Yorkshire from 1877, spent his retirement campaigning for better conditions for rural postmen. He was still writing letters to his local newspaper in the 1950s, aged 95, on the subject of what the rural walk had cost the men who walked it. The rural round was not a pastoral occupation. It was a physically demanding, weather-indifferent service, performed by individuals working at the outer limit of what the postal system required of a human body. What did the communities on the receiving end of that service understand about the postman's cost that the post office's accounting had NO column for? And what did the postman, who completed the round in the blizzard, understand about why he completed it? Rhenigidale, on the southeast coast of the Isle of Harris in the Outer Hebrides, had no road until February 1990. Until that month, the village, a community of crofters who had survived the clearances and the emigrations, and the economic contractions of the 20th century, was connected to the rest of Harris by a single footpath. That path crossed 3.5 miles of steep terrain, including a series of switchbacks known locally as the Scriob, before descending to the village. Kenneth Mackay walked that path to collect the post from Tarbert and bring it back to Rhenigidale. 3 days a week. In the specific conditions of the Western Isles: wind, low cloud, and occasional conditions that made the Scriob genuinely hazardous. His round was not a romantic undertaking. It was a postal duty, performed on a path that no vehicle could reach because there was no road to build a van route on. What Mackay carried was not only letters. He carried medicine. He carried newspapers. He carried the informal knowledge of what was happening in Tarbert and the wider world, that a community without a shop, without a doctor in walking distance, and without a road, needed in order to remain connected to the administrative and social systems of the country. Rhenigidale had campaigned for a road for 60 years. When work finally began in 1989 and the road opened in February 1990, Kenneth Mackay, who had spent a significant part of his own life advocating for it, did not have to walk the Scriob again to collect the post. A van could reach the village. The village was saved from abandonment, the same abandonment that had already taken the neighbouring settlement of Gearaid Lotaigir and dozens of other Hebridean communities before it. The postman's path still exists. It is now walked by tourists. What did the path carry for all those years between Tarbert and Rhenigidale that the road, when it came, could not carry in the same way? And what does it mean for a community when the person who connected it to the world no longer needs to walk to do it? The red post office Morris Minor van reached the rural routes of Highland, Scotland and Wales in the late 1950s and through the 1960s. The decision was operational and logical. A van could cover 3 times the distance in the same time, carry more mail, service more households, and return to the depot before the afternoon collection. Every calculation the post office made came out in the van's favour. What the calculation did not include, what it was not designed to include, was what the walking postman's 14 years on the same path had built. The round continued. The letters were delivered. The farms and crofts received their mail in less time. The postman, who had swept the snow, who had sat at the kitchen table, who had known from the handwriting whose letter it was, before he reached the gate, that postman now covered 3 routes in the time the walk had taken, for 1. The post office recognised this in time. In Scotland and Wales, postal workers continued to be associated with informal welfare checks on isolated elderly residents, well into the 21st century. Some things embedded in the practice of daily presence are not transferred by the vehicle program. The post office's own internal reviews of the 1960s noted that the social function of the rural round could not be fully accounted for in the operational transition. Stuart Lewis, who had walked the 15-mile Shap route for years, put it plainly when the van arrived. It broke his heart. Not once had they failed to complete the round. The van completed the delivery. It did not complete the walk. Alasdair Gillies retired from the Easter Ross round in 1955. He had been on the same walk for 28 years. The Uppercroft got a telephone in 1963. News from the family in Glasgow arrived on Sunday evenings. What the telephone gave them, the voice, the second question, answered in the same moment. The knowledge that the person on the other end was well, without waiting 2 weeks to learn it. What it did not ask them to keep. The letters already in the drawer. The handwriting, the evidence, in paper and ink, that, across the distance, the family had not been forgotten. The telephone did not know to ask them to keep anything. It did not leave anything behind. If this channel is going to keep documenting what the Royal Mail carried and what it meant to the people who received it, subscribe. There are more rounds, more sorting offices, more walks through Highland glens and Welsh mountain passes, more letters from sons and daughters and emigrant relatives that arrived at isolated farm doors where someone had been watching the path since morning. What Kenneth Mackay carried over the Scriob 3 times a week between Tarbert and Rhenigidale was not a bag of letters. It was the only regular evidence for a community with no road, no doctor, and no shop, that the world beyond the hill remembered them. And if you have a letter kept in a drawer or a tin box from a father who served, or a mother who emigrated, or a son who wrote back from Australia, put it in the comments. Or tell us about the postman who knew your family's name before he reached the gate. Did you know a postman like this? One who walked the same path for 20 years and knew your family's name before he reached the gate? Or did someone in your family wait for a letter at a farm road end on an island, or on a hill where the postman was the only regular visitor? Put it in the comments. In a future video, the village sub-post office network, the counter behind the general store door, and what it meant to be the postal system's final point of contact with the communities that needed it most.